There is a possible change in U.S. troop roles in South Korea. This is quite an important issue for our security strategy. Now let's hear from our Foreign Affairs and Security Correspondent, Jae-mook Kang. Reporter Kang, U.S. troops in South Korea are like an aircraft carrier. In the end, it feels like our country is a base for war against China. What is the likelihood of China invading Taiwan?
U.S. intelligence agencies and conservative figures close to Trump suggest there's a possibility that President Xi Jinping of China could invade Taiwan by 2027. However, at the current stage, it's more about preparing for the possibility and strongly containing China than actually preparing for war. Because of this, the role of U.S. troops in South Korea should not be limited to the Korean Peninsula, but should be utilized to contain China, which is gaining traction among U.S. conservatives.
With China ramping up its military power and becoming more aggressive under the so-called U.S.-China strategic competition.
However, even if China's invasion of Taiwan happens and U.S. troops in South Korea are deployed, it's unlikely that our forces would immediately join, since we must also prepare for North Korea.
So, as you mentioned, it's unlikely, but it seems like a big burden for us to decide whether we should fight alongside U.S. troops in South Korea against China. Is the scope of U.S. troops in South Korea expanding like this? What's the reason behind it?
First of all, the commander's mention of a role change for U.S. troops in South Korea and the necessity of containing China reflects the atmosphere in Washington. However, this is not entirely a new idea. The U.S.-ROK Mutual Defense Treaty clearly specifies that our military alliance with South Korea extends far beyond just the Korean Peninsula and encompasses the entire Pacific region. Article 3, signed back in 1953, outlines necessary actions to effectively address the common threats we face in the Pacific. This treaty, signed over 70 years ago, was already anticipating potential dangers in the Pacific region in the future.
The treaty already accounted for threats across the Pacific, but for us, wouldn't the primary concern be deterring North Korea if the nature of U.S. troops in South Korea changes? North Korea has nuclear weapons recently, so what are the concerns about these changes?
Currently, the main goal of U.S. forces in South Korea is to counter North Korea. Looking at Article 2 of the Mutual Treaty, if any party recognizes an armed attack from outside, it will take appropriate actions. For us as a divided nation, the target is inevitably North Korea. The primary goal of the U.S.-South Korea alliance is undeniably a military partnership primarily focused on addressing the threats posed by North Korea. The Indo-Pacific Command, which U.S. troops in South Korea belong to, has recently made it clear that they oppose reducing the U.S. troop presence in South Korea.
To say, will he invade or won't he invade, we're talking about probabilities. With the loss of the force on the Korean Peninsula, there's a higher probability that he would invade.
If the U.S. adjusts its strategic guidelines to expand the strategic flexibility of U.S. troops in South Korea based on its interests, diplomatic conflicts seem inevitable.
We can't just push our agenda, and the strategic flexibility of U.S. forces in Korea can change any time. So, with the election ongoing, do the candidates have related pledges?
So far, claims are only being made behind the scenes in the U.S. Since official moves haven't been confirmed yet, domestic presidential candidates don't have specific stances. The Democratic Party of Korea candidate Lee Jae-myung is notable for his pledge to recover wartime operational control. As this is something the U.S. is also asking for, if he is elected, the speed of operational control transfer could increase. On the other hand, the People Power Party candidate Kim Moon-soo has pledged to deploy U.S. strategic assets to a level of permanent stationing, emphasizing the role of U.S. troops in South Korea.
Yes, we've looked into the potential changes in the role of U.S. troops in South Korea and the candidates' pledges. That was reporter Kang Jae-mook.